I'm Jenny Blood. I was a counsellor at the Royal Women's Hospital, and I in fact started there in 1984 in the social work department, because the Women's Hospital was quite unique in that the RBU, as it was known then, employed social workers to do the counselling for the couples going through the donor program. And that was long before any legislation or requirement for compulsory counselling. So it was, the medical staff there, particularly the head of the unit at that time, I think was very aware of the couple's needs for counselling and ensured through the social work department that it was provided.
Mm. So Jenny, can you explain a little bit about what was involved in the counselling?
Yes. It changed over the years. At the very beginning there were in fact 4 interviews for the couples concerned. So the couple were referred by their treating clinician once they identified that the male was infertile and may need donor sperm. So the couple came to see the counsellor initially, and that was a general discussion, usually around how they had managed the diagnosis. And in many ways that first interview was effectively grief counselling. And the couple obviously were devastated that they had lost the opportunity to have their own biological offspring. And the male was often in shock, amazed that, because most men didn't even think about infertility before they married. So the first interview, often we didn't even begin to talk about issues around donor conception. It was more about how the couple were managing the diagnosis of infertility. And sometimes that led on to further counselling depending on what happened in that initial interview. The next interview was with the individual people. So I would meet with the wife initially and then with the husband, and in those days it was the husband and wife. You had to be legally married in Victoria to have donor sperm. And that was an opportunity for each of those individuals to explore how they were feeling and were perhaps more able to be open without their partner there about their anger, their shame, their guilt, all those very strong emotions that at a time of crisis couples may have difficulty sharing with each other. And then there'd be a final interview, and obviously these could lead on to other things. If issues arose within any of these interviews, you would extend the counselling time. But the final interview was about what does it mean to have a donor-conceived family. Having made the decision to do that, how was that going to be managed in their relationship? And that's when the issues around informing the child in the future, how that might be managed, and all those sorts of issues would be addressed, and then they would start treatment. So it was a long counselling process at the Women's. It would often go over many months before the couple themselves would be ready to start. I actually started at a very strange time. The clinic, or the government in fact, had shut down the program because of the risk of HIV being transmitted. So the clinic was closed because we weren't confident that the donors were safe, and they all had to be recalled and retested and quarantined. So the couples were also dealing with the issue of having to wait, which for many of them was very, very frustrating. Having made the decision and then to be told that they couldn't proceed for some time. Yeah, so it was a long process, and I think it was quite unique to the Women's. And as I was saying earlier, it's probably why I remember those earlier people more readily, because I spent quite a lot of time with them as couples and individuals exploring all those issues.
But has it always been encouraged for parents to be open to their children?
No, it hasn't. And again, I think the Women's was unique in that the social work department was involved initially, and we were next door to the adoption worker. So there was a lot of common ground in our department. But I think in the medical setting it was different. And that was for a number of reasons. Certainly the doctors were primarily wanting to treat their patient, and their goal was to get their patient pregnant, and this was the way that they what they had to offer the couple. And they also wanted to be confident that the donors were not being in any way jeopardised by what they were doing. And I think there was a feeling within the medical profession that it was probably best all round just to keep it quiet. But I think that was often based in a lack of knowledge. I mean, their training wasn't psychology or social work. It was medicine. And medicine was about providing a treatment, not about worrying about what the implications of the treatment might be. And so they were doing their job, offering a treatment. And they may not even have raised these issues with their patients. It was just a matter of providing the appropriate treatment for them and ensuring that the men that were donating the sperm were given what they thought was best for them, which was anonymity. Because they were concerned back in those earlier days that there might be legal implications for the donor. And again, I don't think they had the training or the foresight to anticipate anything that might have eventuated, in fact, quite so quickly. And I think, one of our roles at the Women's was to change that thinking. And we had team meetings every Friday, and it was an opportunity to raise these sorts of issues and have some discussion with the medical staff. And I think it was also true of nursing staff. Again, they came out of a different educational model, and their role again was to get their patients pregnant and not worry too much about anything else. And that was their priority, and that's what the patients wanted. At that point, they wanted a baby. Okay. Well, let me talk about anonymity. Anonymity, I think, was based primarily on protection. Protection of the donor to ensure that there was no comeback or legal responsibilities that might fall on him, and any other unforeseen issues that might arise as a result of his donation. It was also protection of the male in particular. Men, as a rule, unless there's a good medical reason, find the diagnosis of infertility absolutely devastating. And what they can't imagine is telling their parents, telling their friends that they can't have a baby because all their friends are having babies. And their parents are looking forward to being grandparents, and they want to be grandparents of their own biological grandchildren. So for many couples, it was acceptable that there was anonymity because it allowed them to pretend that everything was okay. And it was in a culture at the time where that was encouraged. The medical profession accepted that that was probably the better way to go. And people struggled with how they might manage being open. There were no guidelines, there were no avenues that they could think of. And certainly this issue of telling others was something they just balked at. A son telling his father was going to be very difficult. I think we also need to put it in the context of where the world was at that time. It was at a time when IVF was very, very new, and IVF was very controversial. There was a lot of debate and discussion about whether IVF was ethically appropriate, morally right, religiously appropriate. There was very, very strong opposition to IVF in those days. Manipulation of embryos by men was just seen to be test tube babies and all that sort of thing. So there was a lot of uncertainty about infertility treatments at that time. And so again, I think it added to the couples and the medical profession's need to just keep this one under the radar so that people weren't confronted with perhaps some hostility that they were involved in these sorts of treatments. So it's a complex thing, anonymity. I don't believe at any point there was much thought about the offspring in those early days. It was all about management of the issues, management of the culture, management of the medical treatment, and management of what is happening now to us as a couple, and how do we manage this in a society where having an affair with another man is taboo, where you had hoped to have a child with your husband and now you're having it with another man, where your wife is now conceiving with somebody else. You know, they're very, very complex emotional issues, and that's what people were struggling with then. So to bring in what anonymity might mean in the future for offspring was really right off the radar in those very early days. It came onto the radar, I think, partly at Women's through the involvement of the social work department, which was influenced by a different culture and a different way of managing these issues. But I think it took a long time, and it probably still happens, that couples still struggle with how do they manage telling, not just I think telling the offspring's the easiest. It's telling all the other people in their lives that have the same expectations they had about having a biological child. It's very different now, of course. Everybody has access to donor sperm, and there's been a complete shift. And I think that was partly due to the beginning of the use of eggs for donation. People were much more able to talk about a woman donating eggs to another woman because there wasn't the divide of the gender and the sexuality and the innuendos around that. Which leads me to matching. Is that okay?
Yes, that's great.
So, in the early days, because of the need for anonymity, there was a need to select a donor where hopefully there would be no evidence that there'd been a different sperm used in the creation of the child. So donors were matched with the husband's characteristics: hair colour, eye colour, height, build, and blood group. Because blood group of all those characteristics, and I'm not a doctor so I might get this wrong, is the one that's specifically inherited. If both your parents are O positive and have got a recessive A or whatever, you can usually predict or know what your blood group's going to be. So if you go along to the hospital when your leg's broken at 8 and the doctor says, well, this child's B negative, couldn't possibly be your child, it's not going to be a nice fit at that time for the couple if they wanted to keep it anonymous. So one of the critical things at that time was to match the blood group to ensure that there was no possibility of being revealed in that medical way. So that's how it was when I started, and the matching was done by the nurse that was in charge of the clinic. The clinic was run by one nurse, so it was a very small team. It was the counsellor and the nurse, basically. Once the doctor had finished the diagnosis and determined what the treatment would be, the couple was referred to the donor clinic, and that was myself and the nurse in charge of the clinic and her nurse who covered weekends, because you have to have the treatment available 7 days a week. So it was a small group and we worked well together, but initially it was the nurse that did the matching, and it was purely on the basis of those medical characteristics. And there wasn't a lot of choice for the patient. She would just identify the characteristics, inform the couple what they were. She would also, in the context of doing the matching, see if the donor had been successful in the past, how many offspring he may already have, and try and divvy it up fairly, if you like. I don't quite know what the right terminology is. That, I don't know when it changed, but at some point it changed to the point where I did the matching. And at that time also we increased the amount of information that was available to the couple. And I imagine your parents have something similar to what we offered at that time, which was all the physical characteristics, plus their occupation, their educational level, interests, hobbies, medical stuff, message to the couple. I forget now, it was a while ago, but a lot more detail about who the donors were. And basically I would, as I was saying to Roger, there were very few to choose from. So literally just say, well, here are the 6 we can offer you today. And often you'd give the couples those sheets of paper to take home, and they could consider which one they might like to start with. But it was often the case, if a pregnancy wasn't occurring, that they'd be offered another donor in the hope that there was something more compatible or in sync or whatever it is that makes babies. The other significant person in the donor team was the andrologist, of course. He was responsible for the donors, basically. So the donor would see the doctor, and the doctor would do a physical exam and take a medical history, and then the donor would go to andrology, and the andrologist would do the sperm analysis and determine whether his sperm was appropriate for the program. And that was a bit devastating for those men for whom it wasn't, of course, so they sometimes needed counselling. It was up to the andrologist to code the donor, and it started with AA. So the first donor was AA, and the next one was AB and AC, and by the time I was there, they were up to K, I think, or J. So it was a 2-letter code, and they was just allocated this. The andrology kept all those records, the donor code and all the medical information. They kept all the detail about the donor. So when I needed it, I pulled it up from andrology. So that was all contained in one separate area. It wasn't disseminated broadly around the hospital. And it was about it, really. It was up to andrology to recall the donors after their 6-month quarantine to rescreen them. At some point, I can't remember when, I started to counsel the donors as well. Maybe the early 90s. I really can't remember. It must have been after 88 or round about, perhaps when the legislation was coming through. And so I took an opportunity then to explore with the donor why he was doing it, what his expectations were, and what the long-term outcomes might be. And very early on I started to say, do not expect what is happening today to be true in time to come. If you are not comfortable with openness, you might want to think twice about doing this. Even though now, initially they had the right of veto, but there was enough mumblings going on for people with any sense to recognise things weren't going to stay the same. If the donor was married, the wife was not required to consent, but I encouraged her to come in for counselling as well, but she didn't have to do that.
Can I ask if the donors were paid, and if so, if you know how much they were?
They were reimbursed for their costs. Yep. So it was nominal. I don't know I think it was, I have no idea. It was a nominal cost to cover tram fare and lunch, but it was a fixed amount, so they didn't have to have the rigmarole of filling in vouchers or whatever. But money wasn't the motivation for these men. They were motivated for all sorts of different reasons. A lot of them genuinely wanted to help. Were donors interested to know the outcome? Probably, but they never imagined that I think donors didn't realise they had as many rights as they thought they might have had. They donated their sperm, and they thought that was probably the end of it, because in early days it was anonymous, and they thought that they'd done their bit, and so I don't think we gave them much permission to inquire, and that was probably our negligence on our part, not to acknowledge their need for information as well. But certainly some would have been interested, and would have inquired, but I don't think many did, until perhaps much later on, when the legislation came in and there was more publicity in the press, and I think, oh God, I donated 15 years ago, wonder what happened. And they would ring the hospital and inquire. It was, and I think this may have been the issue with your donor, it was a bit hit and miss as to who they got. And that was probably one of the problems with the process, that if they got through to the social work department, they get a very different response than if they would have got from andrology, because scientists deal with things much more matter-of-factly than social workers do. And, you know, it may have been a little bit dependent on why the donor donated initially. Some men donated because they recognised they wouldn't have their own children. They never found the right woman, and they were worried that they may not, and they were still keen to think that they had produced children at some level. And I think they probably would have been more interested. I suspect donors were particularly interested once they had their own children. Because there's the reality. This is what sperm does. It makes these beautiful babies. How many other beautiful babies might I have made? And I suspect that's probably would have been a trigger for a lot of men to find out.
Did you notice that there was a commonality in the people that were coming in to donate in their professions, or...?
No, not really. I think there was a myth that it was medical students. I don't think that's true. In fact, they probably were the least likely to donate because they knew the professor and didn't want to bump into him in the corridor. But no, look, they came from a broad range of professions, mainly professional people. I think it was more difficult for men that worked contract labour or strange hours to It was quite a commitment to make. You had to come in and do the tests, and then you had to come in over a series of weeks to donate. So it was quite a time commitment that the donors had to make. So you had to be in a situation where your work or whatever your lifestyle was enabled you to do that. So if you're a long-term truck driver or nothing, you know, occupations where that was less likely. So there probably were more professional people, just because they had the capacity and the time to make themselves available, to give the time that was required.
Would you be able to talk a little bit about how many siblings could come from one donation at the time, and if that changed?
Oh yes, that was a real problem in the early days. There was no control over how many offspring a donor would have. And so there were a number of donors that had far more than they should have, you know, 8, 10, 12 offspring. That changed. It changed in practice then, and it changed through guidelines that were put out by the Fertility Society of Australia. And it was reduced, I think, when I was there to 5. I don't, it may be even less now, but it was a real problem for the clinic in terms of matching, because you'd have a number of donors available, you'd have a number of recipients available, and if you had 10 recipients and 10 donors, that's fine. But if one got pregnant, do you take her donor out till you understand what the outcome of that is? And then you wanted to be confident that if the couple came back for a second child, that the same sperm was available. So you were trying to keep sperm on hold for existing families. You wanted to ensure that you weren't creating too many families with the one donor. There weren't many donors to choose from anyway. So it was a real struggle to try and if one donor was particularly fertile, it was very tempting if a couple wasn't getting pregnant to use him, because it might be the final breakthrough for that couple to have a baby. So you were tossing up all sorts of dilemmas with your matching and trying to reduce the number of families. Because effectively what it would have meant, and what it did mean at times, was there was a waiting list. We can't make a donor available to you at the moment because we've got 8 women currently matched to him. If they all get pregnant, we've got a problem. In fact, it shouldn't have been 8, it was probably less than that. But you see the point I'm making. So.
And did things change when sperm could be frozen? Could you talk a little bit?
That was long before my day.
Okay.
Sperm was frozen long time. It was easy to freeze sperm. Very hard to freeze an egg, but very easy to freeze sperm. So it was only way back probably before it was done in public hospitals, when it was done in those very early days by private doctors, that fresh sperm was used, and for a very short period of time, because it was easy to freeze. In terms of follow-up for the couples and for the donors, there was none. I mean, really, from a medical perspective, all that was required was to know the outcome of the treatment. So there could be a formal record of how successful a donor had been, how many offspring, how many babies had been born, the gender of those babies, and obviously how well they were fit and well. Donors, I don't think, were ever offered ongoing counselling. Couples were, but very few, if any, availed themselves of that. I think they were glad to see the back of us. It was an awful way to get pregnant. It was a very clinical way of getting pregnant. The way the couple were treated was gently and as nicely and as well as possibly could be. But nonetheless, it was a clinical procedure. In a clinical room. I mean, obviously the husband could be present, but it was not a nice way to get pregnant. So once you were pregnant, you just wanted to get out of there and get on with your life and then start, like the rest of your friends, to have a family and enjoy your family and all of that stuff. So it was offered to couples. Very few picked it up. Some did further down the track, and I think that was the benefit of me being there for such a long time. They could ring me because they knew me. They didn't. If it had been someone else, they might have, assuming they liked me in the first place. Some didn't, I'm sure. But there were some that were struggling with telling, and they wanted to come back and review that and how they might do it. But they were few and far between. Most people just got on with their lives. You saw them again when they came back for number 2, but there was no requirement for them to have counselling at that time. It was assumed that they were okay, and that was probably not ideal. They perhaps should have had time to review where they were at, but that's not how it worked. Sperm was very precious in every clinic, so we didn't give it to anyone else. There were very few occasions. If a couple had moved interstate and wanted to use the same donor, we would ship it interstate for them. But that was very rare. And certainly once the legislation came in, we couldn't ship it out because the other states and countries overseas couldn't comply with the requirements of the register. But just from a practical point of view, we needed all the sperm we could get. So it wasn't at the women's shipped around, except in those exceptional circumstances where it might be for an existing family that wanted to use the same sperm. But it was often easier for her to come back to the clinic. Yeah, so no, it wasn't something that was commonly done. Things may well have changed. It's a long time since it's over 10 years since I've worked there, so things have changed, I'm sure.
I can remember being asked as a donor whether I minded my sperm being used for same-sex couples. Can you just talk to Chloe about that?
Yeah, well, back in the good old days, it wasn't a question. You know, only married couples could have donor sperm. Even a de facto couple couldn't have treatment. And in those days, I was doing private counselling for couples going to Albury because they could have treatment over the border. I mean, it was just a nonsense. So no, it wasn't an issue in those early days. Certainly further down the track, yes, we did ask donors what their preferences might be, how they felt about same-sex couples, single women, but that was a long way down the track because it wasn't, I forget when. And we would endeavour to meet the donor's wishes because we recognised that clearly if you had some strong feelings about a same-sex couple using your sperm, we knew that the same-sex couple were going to tell, because clearly they had to say something. And it would be much easier for an offspring to talk to their donor in the future if they felt he was comfortable with the concept of a same-sex relationship. So it was deemed to be in the best interest of the children born to try and match those preferences with the donor. So the cost of donor insemination was not arduous for the couple concerned. It's a very simple medical procedure. So I don't know what the cost was, but it was affordable. I don't even know if there was a Medicare rebate, but it was certainly affordable. It was IVF that was the killer financially, although the women's had a public process in Melbourne IVF, but it's all different now.
Just talk about assessment again.
Yes, so some people were concerned when they came for counselling that somehow they'd have to pass a test to see whether they were suitable to be parents or to have access to the treatment. But it wasn't about assessing whether a couple was. I mean, how can you know? And anyway, it would have been entirely inappropriate. It was up to the couple to determine whether they had access to the treatment or not. I think our role was to ensure that they were as informed as they could be in making the decision themselves as to whether to have treatment or not. And there were some couples that didn't proceed with treatment. Some couples said, "Nah, this is not for us. If we can't have our own baby, we don't want any baby. And this is all too hard, and we don't need to do this." And I think that took a lot of courage as well, because it was a climate where people got married and had babies. And for a married couple to say, "No, we've chosen not to have a family," even though they would never reveal why they'd made that choice, was a courageous thing to do. A few of the donors didn't proceed, but again, we didn't assess donors. Sperm, it's what's genetic, really. I guess if we were aware they'd had a major criminal record or something, we might not have accepted them. But we didn't do police checks. We just took people at their face value, really. And the critical thing was the sperm analysis.
So did that involve medical testing of the donor to make sure that they were healthy enough, or...?
Yes, look, I didn't do the medical testing, obviously. There was a particular doctor at the hospital who was, he was an andrologist, not an andrologist. Anyway, he was a male infertility specialist. He examined the donors, did a full body exam, and the donors were tested for various infectious diseases, and it wasn't until much later on that we started to look at whether we should do genetic testing, but that came in much, much later, because that was a bit more problematic. But we started to do that, and then you'd discover something in the donor that was of concern, and the donor would have to be informed and counselled, and it opened up a whole new area of work for everybody, so, which was fine, but it just added to the workload. But initially it was just blood tests for hepatitis, HIV, I forget what they all are now. There's a number of them. The women's, it was, in terms of the layout for couples, it was reasonably safe. Their initial constant contact was with the social work department, so it was quite separate from the reproductive biology unit. That was on another level altogether. The social work department was on the ground floor, so they come into this nice waiting area, lovely receptionist, and we had an office not dissimilar to this, with a nice window and couches, and and it was fine. And there were other couples, and it was also the area of adoption, so there were infertile couples. They didn't know necessarily that that's who they all were, but there were no donors anywhere to be seen in the social work department. Once a couple had decided to proceed with treatment, I then introduced them to the sister in charge of the program. So I took them up in the lift to the 3rd floor, and the donor insemination area was behind the lifts, so it was quite separate from the rest of the floor. And that's where they met the nurse sister in charge. Had a matching interview with her initially, and she showed them around, showed them the treatment room, and from then on they just went up to the 3rd floor and had their treatment. And they would not have seen anyone else other than people in the lift well, and you would have no idea who they were, because there was another general surgical ward on the same floor. So there was no risk at the women's of donors and couples having any contact with each other. Andrology was in a completely separate part of the hospital, different entrance. Everything was different. I had to walk miles to get to andrology. Yes, so it was quite separate, and and that worked well for everybody. And for couples that were going to the women's regularly, if a couple got pregnant the first time, it was out of here, great. For couples that were having months and months of treatment, it became a place of refuge where they could come and, because the sister was terrific. I mean, she cared for them and nursed them and pampered them and was a nurse. So it was a place where they could come as a couple and feel relaxed and protected, which was nice.
Mm. Can I ask a question, if you don't mind? In terms of going back to the files, a lot of my friends have had their files misplaced or possibly destroyed. Could you talk a little bit about what you know about that happening in the past?
Look, I think I can't talk about the other hospitals. I think it was different at the women's because the people that were there stayed there. The guy in andrology is still there. So he's been there for 40 years probably, maybe 30 at least. And he's a scientist and he kept very accurate records. The nurse kept very accurate records. The social work records, perhaps not so good, but I was not keeping the medical stuff. I was just keeping notes for myself. So the medical records are all there at the women's. And what's missing is what we didn't ask for in the early days. So in the very early days when it was donor A, B, it's just the physical characteristics because that's all people were asking for. They may have asked for occupation as well back then, but that's all. So there's nothing on the file if people want it because it just was never there. Because of the culture of the anonymity and the protection, and all we're going to match is the physical characteristics anyway, so we don't need any more information. Now that changed and changed fairly quickly, but nonetheless, I think there are issues around the records from those hospitals that no longer exist, where the staff have long gone, and there's no opportunity to trace them back. But I think at the women's, they're probably there. It's what's missing is what was never asked for in the first place, and that's the frustration. I think that it just wasn't seen as necessary, as I was describing earlier. One of the benefits of me being at the women's for such a long time was I had the joy, usually, and the privilege of meeting young people who came back to the women's to try and understand more about their donor conception. It was before this wonderful organisation existed, so they didn't have anywhere to go, so they came back to the women's, and Gab Kovacs at Prince Henry's was doing similar things for their offspring there. And our process at that time was to talk with the young person about why they were doing this, which was pretty obvious, but what their expectations were. And the first thing we said to them was, we will endeavour to contact your donor. We can't guarantee anything because he believes it was anonymous and he doesn't have any responsibilities to you. We may only have one opportunity to talk with him. You need to tell us what you want us to ask him. And that was a challenge because they actually had to articulate, if there was a one-shot go, what they would like us to ask him. So if he was going to say no, we could say, well, that's your right, but there are just a few things the person would like to know. And that took them time. They had to think really hard about that. But the irony was that when we did contact them, and we wrote a letter to the donor of the last known address, and they often was still there, but you could find them on the electoral roll usually, and we'd write this really innocuous letter like, you may recall some time ago you had a brief I forget what it was now. Could you please contact us? and invariably they were only too pleased to give as much information as the offspring wanted. They were usually very happy to exchange letters, and there was a number that made contact with each other. It was very rare that a donor would balk at not having any contact or any... Some of them didn't want to be identified, but they were very comfortable with understanding that that's what this individual needed. So it was a very rewarding experience, and it was nice to reconnect with the donors as well. So that was lovely. But the other point too, and what often these children, or not children, young people wanted was not necessarily to know about their donor, but to know about how many half-siblings they had. It was often a fear that there may be a person of the opposite sex that they were meeting through their studies where they had an attraction to, and they just had that little doubt in their mind as to whether it was a genetic attraction or something else. And so we were able to tell them quite easily, because we did have those records, how many children had been born as a result of that particular donor, what year they were born and what sex they were. And that enabled them then to get that information. And usually it was sufficient for them to feel some relief that it wasn't going to happen. So that was a lovely job to start off in those early days and working with. And the couples were a delight to work with. It was one of those very rare, perhaps not rare, but it was a counselling session where the couples wanted to engage. Usually people come to counselling because they have to, or they've got issues or problems. These couples didn't have problems. They just had a medical diagnosis that had thrown them completely off whack. And it was lovely to be able to sit with them and work through all of that with them. And at the end of the day, when I left to be meeting some of those young people that was born, it was a pretty special job.